sharing today. We wanted to make a note that the slides that we'll be sharing and the some of like the fact sheets that we'll be talking about will make available on the webpage after this, so you can check back within the week and you'll have that information. If you have questions as we go, we encourage you to put those questions in the chat, and we will do our best with Melissa and Jackie's support to kind of answer those in real time, just because we you know, if there's a question about a specific data point, if we wait till the end, it may not be as relevant as like when we're talking about it. So please feel free to add those questions to the chat. We'll do our best to answer them as we go, just kind of depending on how much time we have. All right. So without further ado, I would love to pass it over to Melissa, Adolfson, and Jackie. So thanks again.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, tech support. Happy to be here. As Emily said, I'm Melissa Adolfson. I'm with Wilder Research. I've been working with the More Resilient Minnesota initiative for quite some time now, supporting communities with assessments, using your assessment findings to drive decision-making, and then also putting together evaluation plans based on those resilience plans. I'm a huge fan of the Minnesota Student Survey, so I'm super excited to be here today with Jackie to share some findings. And in the blurb about our session, Emily mentioned that we're going to share examples from 3 communities about how they're engaging youth in making meaning out of the data. And bonus, we added a 4th the other night, so more content. I'll hand it. Oh, and I guess wanted to say too, I was just really excited about Dante's keynote presentation, and a couple of things that really resonated with me when I'm presenting Minnesota Student Survey data. It's so important that we're asking young people to take this really, really long survey with a lot of questions and somewhat invasive questions. And it's so important that we listen to what they have to say and that we believe what they have to say. So I thought that was so important that, and that's what Jackie and I are here to talk about, is the importance of elevating youth voice, believing what they're sharing through the survey, and finding ways to act on it. Hand it over to Jackie.
All right. So I love everything that Melissa said. It's really exciting to be able to do this presentation today and have it mesh so well with what Dante was already talking about. I'm hoping that as people watch the presentation, they're thinking about youth-led projects that they've been involved in, that we can share with discussion at the end after we talk about the examples that we have. So a little about me. I've been working with the MSS data for almost a decade now. It's pretty exciting for me. Through DHS, mostly through substance use prevention and also ACEs prevention. But then I also started working with the MSS interagency team recently. So I'm very, very heavily invested in the MSS data and really excited about it. And I need some of those reminders, I think maybe we all do, that we actually have to listen to kids' voices as well as just looking at the data. So that's a constant reminder for me in my life. So I'm going to start the presentation now. All right. So we're going to be looking at the 2022 survey results. The results were just made public earlier this year. So, and the survey was administered last year at about this time, January through June. So I'm just going to go through some of the Minnesota Student Survey background for people that aren't familiar with it. It's administered by 5 different state agencies, Corrections, MDE, Department of Health, Department of Human Services, and Public Safety. It's been conducted every 3 years since 1989. So we have a really long trend, which is very useful for us. It's a census design instead of a random sample, which again makes it an amazing data source because we have a really robust sample. It's voluntary and anonymous. So I'll be talking about some data points and I'll say, you know, you can ask for your data for your community, but we do have some restrictions on how small the sample sizes can go, because we take the anonymity very seriously. And then there are 3 age-appropriate versions of the survey: level 1, which is grade 5, level 2, which is grade 8, and then level 3, which is grades 9 and 11, and then the alternative learning centers and the justice facilities. So we're looking at a graph of participation for their survey. And as you can see, unfortunately, it seems to be declining. This is probably for a number of different reasons. I think part of the issue for 2022 was COVID and a lot of political issues. But I want to point out that at the same time, while participation has gone down, it's still about 135,000 students. So again, still a very robust sample. And we hope to increase this for 2025. So the Minnesota Student Survey, the content includes school experiences, relationships that students have with adults and other students, how they spend their out of school time and sort of the experiences that they have there, their mental and physical health, including depression and anxiety, which we'll talk about later, and physical health, including what they eat and how much they exercise, substance use patterns, sexual health, and then, of course, adverse childhood experiences. So the relevance now, so there are some particular issues that we're paying close attention to recently. The first one is the reason that we're here, right? So recognition of trauma, use of trauma-informed practices, and looking at how to mitigate ACEs with the data that we have about the students in our state. We're also paying close attention to substance use patterns in light of the new cannabis laws in Minnesota. We're looking at the effects of COVID and COVID changes with students, and also, which has been really important and featured a lot in our work, unfortunately, is the worsening mental health of young people. So here we have a pie chart of the prevalence of ACEs in the state. So about half of the students in the state report having 1 or more adverse childhood experiences, and about a quarter have 2 or more. So generally what we see about ACEs is that students report about the same proportion regardless of grade level. It does sometimes go up somewhat from grades 8 to 11, but generally pretty much about the same. And also it hasn't changed very much over time. We'll see in a graph coming up, but it was 53% of students in 2022 had 0 ACEs, and this increased 1% from 52% in 2019. So relatively stable. And here we have the list of adverse childhood experiences that are on the Minnesota Student Survey. So of course, this is not an exhaustive list of adverse experiences that a student could encounter, and it doesn't mirror one-to-one the original ACEs study or other ACEs reports that different agencies have put out. So mental illness in the household, which is has the greatest prevalence, was only included on the survey in 2019. So we only have 2 years of data for that. And until that point, the most prevalent had always been parental incarceration. We also ask about verbal abuse, physical abuse, alcohol abuse in the household, so by anybody who lives in the household, sexual abuse of the person taking the survey, domestic abuse, again, involving other people in the household, and drug use in the household. So the trends that we have, as I mentioned before, are relatively stable. So household mental illness went up a little bit in 2022. I think this wouldn't be a surprise to anybody who's lived through the pandemic. But caregiver incarceration, verbal abuse, et cetera, have all remained pretty steady. I would say what I have found interesting and is being worked on a little bit at the state is this rise in reports of sexual abuse by students. So this is a little bit of a spotlight on that. So since 2016 or maybe 2013, sexual abuse reports have gone up to 6% of students reporting a non-family perpetrator and a little over 3% reporting a family perpetrator. Again, this is something that has to be looked at to see if this is to see what this pattern is reflecting. And here we have a map of prevalence of adverse childhood experiences. It is relatively, distributed across the state pretty evenly. So, and then we have on the survey, we have kind of a robust section of gender identity that was introduced in 2019, expanding on, or in 2022, expanding on what we had before since 2016. But so we can report any of our statistics by the gender identity characterizations. We generally, in the rest of this presentation, are going to be using male and female as reported on birth certificates. But if anybody needs to see data or would like to see data that's broken out by gender identity, we have that available. So you can just shoot me an email if you want to see something about that. But here we can see that students that identify as transgender or gender fluid, gender nonconforming, and gender queer are more likely to report having 2 or more ACEs. We also can look at the breakdown by sexual orientation. Again, students that are pansexual, students that are queer are more likely than other students to report having experienced 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. And then we also have breakdown by race and ethnicity. So we have expanded categories of those as well since 2019. Again, if there is something more that you would like to see, please don't hesitate to ask. We have breakdowns such as Somalian and Ethiopian students, etc. But here we can see that American Indian and Alaskan Native students, multiracial children, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander children bear the brunt of adverse childhood experiences. So we can talk a lot about adverse childhood experiences and negative outcomes. The goal here is not to overwhelm people with data and with negativity. So we'll be looking at 3 of the outcomes and one of them only very briefly. So we'll be looking at anxiety and depression and substance use. But we can look at a lot of different behaviors on the Minnesota Student Survey. So the survey includes suicidal ideation and attempts, self-harm, and then other externalizing behaviors such as bullying and gambling and other behaviors like running away from home, etc. So I just want everybody to know that we have these data, but we're not going to throw them all at you today. So, one of the main concerns that we've been hearing from communities is about levels of mental health indicators in their students, so levels of anxiety and depression. So here, I think, again, this is probably not a surprise to anybody. The number of adverse childhood experiences a student has had increases the likelihood that they're going to report having symptoms of anxiety in the past 2 weeks. And this is a dramatic stepwise relationship. So students with 0 ACEs, under 20% of them report having anxiety in the past 2 weeks. And of students with 4 or more ACEs, over 70% report having anxiety. And here we see that the students who are reporting the highest levels of anxiety are the female students. So, and this holds true for every grade. And here, the question about anxiety has only been on the student survey for the last 2 administrations. So we don't have a long trend line, but we can see the difference between 2019 and 2022. And obviously, especially for female students, levels of anxiety have increased quite a bit. from 35% to almost 45%. So we look at anxiety and we also look at depression. Again, the levels of depression show the same sort of stepwise increase with the level of adverse childhood experiences that a student has. So again, a student with 0 ACEs, 14.5% of them report having depression in the past 2 weeks. And of students with 4 or more ACEs, again, almost 70% report having depression. So this is very serious for those students. Oops. And again, we see a very similar pattern here. When we look at the results by sex, female students are more likely to report having symptoms of depression. And here we have a little bit longer of a trend, or an actual trend, because you need to have 3 points to have a trend. So it has increased quite a bit for both male and female students, as you can see. And again, we can look at the symptoms of depression as reported by students based on their gender identity. Again, trans students and gender fluid, non-conforming, queer students are more likely to report having symptoms of depression. And the disparities are quite large. And again, the pansexual and queer students here are also more likely to report having depression. I think, again, not a surprise with what's been going on recently. And then we have also the breakdown by race and ethnicity. Again, American Indian and Alaskan Native students and students that are multiracial are more likely to report having depression in the past 2 weeks. So I'm just going to go really quickly through students reporting substance use by adverse childhood experiences. Again, it almost gets boring with this stepwise progression. Students with no ACEs, about 3% of them have engaged in alcohol use in the past month, whereas students with 4 or more ACEs, almost 40% of them have used alcohol in the past month. The use of e-cigarettes increases as well in a stepwise manner, as does the use of marijuana and the misuse of prescription drugs. So what we'd like to talk about now is some of the protective factors and measures of resilience that we look at on the Minnesota Student Survey, especially in the context of adverse childhood experiences and depression. So that's what I'll be looking at in the rest of the presentation. We'll be looking at caring relationships, being able to talk to an adult about problems, developmental assets, feeling safe, and engaging in rewarding activities after school. So again, I'm not going to throw a ton of data at you right now, but I'm going to talk about these 4 specific questions that are on the survey. So look at my notes here. Okay. So the question that we use quite a bit when we're talking about resilience for students is students feeling cared about by adults. You can see here in this graph that students are pretty likely to feel like they are cared about by their parents. It's gone down slightly, but not too much. They feel less cared about by their relatives in 2022, and feeling cared about by teachers and school staff and adults in the community has also declined since 2019. I think we could speculate possibly that this is also results due to COVID, but it's something to look at. We know that having adults care about students is important. I think that is also not a surprise. Students that feel like their teachers care about them quite a bit or very much are less likely to use alcohol, less likely to use tobacco, less likely to vape or use marijuana or misuse prescription drugs. They're also less likely to report having depression and anxiety. So here we have another graph. So having a teacher care about you makes a student less likely to report depression. Even those students that have 4 or more ACEs, it makes a difference to have an adult at school care about you. And I think this kind of echoes a lot of the things that we've heard already this morning about having an adult in a student's life, helping them make decisions. So students report on the survey whether they feel adults care about them. They also report whether or not they have an adult that they can talk to about problems. So again, it's pretty stable here that they talk to their parents. Over 80% of students report that they can talk to their parents about problems. About a third of students, a little less than a third of students, talk to an adult at school. About a quarter can talk to some other adult, and about 10% of students report that they don't have an adult that they can talk to. So I think one of the important takeaways here is that students may need to be reminded that they have somebody that they can talk to, that adults are going to have to do some work to reach some of these students to remind them that there is somebody listening. Again, talking to school adults is correlated with lower risk of substance use. Students who can talk to an adult at school are less likely to report all kinds of substance use, alcohol, tobacco, vaping, marijuana use, and prescription drug misuse. And they are less likely to report having depression. So I think here the difference isn't as extreme here. So students that have 4 or more ACEs, if they feel like they can talk to an adult about their problems, about 62% of them report having depression. Students who can't talk to an adult, about 68% of them report having depression. I think the important thing here is that this is hopefully a point that could be turned around. If we're below 30%, I think it's possible that there could be some work done to show students that teachers are listening to them, and to have some more communication. So, yes, and what am I looking at here? Okay. So there are some other resilience factors that we ask about on the Minnesota Student Survey that are also declining. So some of these points come from different areas on the survey. We ask about developmental assets, and those are groups of questions. They're sets of assets that we have. There are 3 different sets. So there's empowerment, there's positive identity, and there's social competence. And the scores that students have for these 3 different sets of assets are very predictive of how students will do. So students with positive identity are much less likely to have substance use. They're much less likely to report having depression or anxiety. They're more likely to get good grades, and to succeed in school. We know these things. However, these are sets of between 3 and 8 different indicators. And I think that it can be a little bit daunting to say, all right, we want to help our students. We're going to try to get them to do better on all 8 of these different indicators. And so I looked at 3 of them, and these 3 have very strong associations with positive outcomes. And I think they might be a little bit more attainable to develop a program around. So there's feeling in control of my life and future. This is one of the developmental assets questions. Feeling valued and appreciated by others, again, another developmental asset. And then there's a set of questions on the survey that ask about what students do in their time outside of school. And one of the questions is, when you're involved in these activities, are you able to develop trusting relationships with adults? So all of these have decreased. And this isn't just because of COVID and because students haven't been involved in out of school activities. This has been decreasing over time. But I think instead of just looking at it as though it's a negative story, I think we could look at this as though there's room here to turn this around. Because we can make these rates higher and it can have a large effect on the students in the students' lives. So here are some examples of why these are important. Students that feel in control of their lives and futures are less likely to report depression. I think this is probably a no-brainer for people, but the difference here is pretty stark. Students who feel valued and appreciated by others are also less likely to report depression. Again, I think not a surprise. And then students who, when they are involved in activities after school, develop trusting relationships with adults are less likely to report having depression. So again, I chose some of these factors to examine from the student survey because we are talking specifically about programs that are student-led, that have attainable goals. And I think that some of these questions are ways to measure whether or not these things have been attained. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa now from the data heavy part of things to the more, what are we going to do with the data and how do we get the kids involved kind of thing. So here you go, Melissa. You can let me know when you want me to change the page.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we're going to actually be featuring 4 communities and ways in which they've engaged young people in making meaning out of the data. And a huge shout out and thank you to each of these communities for letting us feature the work that they're doing. So next slide. For those of you who missed the earlier breakout session or attended a different breakout session, I would encourage you, once they're posted, to go back and watch the recording of the Reach Youth Advisory Board session with young people from Carleton County. My couple of slides here is not going to do this justice, so I really encourage you to watch that. But one thing that's really important about Reach's Youth Advisory Board is that it's an ongoing partnership with young people to elevate their voice and give them an opportunity to weigh in on decisions that impact their lives. So in this session, we're kind of talking about how communities have used different approaches to engage youth in making meaning out of their Minnesota student survey data, but the Youth Advisory Board is so much more. They come together to plan activities and supports for peers and other students. They meet with the county and meet with school admin to advocate for changes that are beneficial to young people. And what they're really about is a youth-adult partnership with that sense of nothing about us without us, which we also heard from Dante in the beginning. Young people are engaged in making those decisions, and they really build on the Search Institute's developmental relationships of adults expressing care, challenging them, setting that bar a little bit higher, providing support to them without making decisions for them, sharing that power with them, and then expanding their possibilities. All things that Dante was talking about this morning. And what they've done, the Youth Advisory Board, is worked on a youth-led and adult-supported strategic planning process with their Minnesota student survey data, as well as other data. So next slide. One thing that was really cool that Reach shared with me is in 2021, the Youth Advisory Board put together a community resilience plan that was really a response to what young people were experiencing during COVID. So the young people themselves took a look at their data and made decisions about what were priorities and what they wanted to address. And in that goal, in that plan, they laid out goals of working to increase and enhance school capacity for social emotional learning and restorative practices, enhancing academic engagement for young people. So one of the things the Youth Advisory Board has been involved in is this summer credit recovery camp. where young people can obtain credit if they fell behind, doing really amazing things like applying reading and science in training dogs and sailing and building a picnic table and growing herbs. That plan also set out some recommendations for moving towards more equitable grading practices. And there was also a heavy focus on reducing disparities. What was really cool too, from someone who's a data geek, in their plan is that they had an action step of developing a community profile based not only on their Minnesota student survey data, but also taking a look at school data, whether that's on absenteeism, grades, taking a look at some public health data on the well-being of young people, but then also having conversations and doing interviews with fellow students, teachers, and school staff to get some qualitative data and stories about what folks are experiencing. And ultimately, they shared that 2021 plan with the schools and with the county to kind of elevate their recommendations and their priorities. Then in 2022 and 2023, a group of some of us adults worked with the Youth Advisory Board to review some data from Greater Minnesota on disparities. So even if we couldn't drill down to the county level or the school district level, always to look at disparities by race, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation, we could do that with data for Greater Minnesota. But then also walking through some local data on adverse childhood experiences, substance use, mental health, and some of those protective factors that Jackie walked through. And then the young people and adults broke into small groups based on topic area and brainstorm strategies for priority areas that they wanted to work on for the purpose of revising that strategic plan that was initially developed in 2021. So next slide. So we're featuring kind of totally different processes and approaches used by communities to engage young people. And so now we're switching gears to Winona County and work that their Substance Use Prevention Coalition did. A few years back at a Minnesota Prevention Program Sharing Conference, I delivered a session on throwing data parties to have a more fun and interactive way of engaging with young people and adults with your Minnesota student survey data. And they kind of took that idea and ran with it. So importantly to note, the Winona Coalition, ASAP, over the past few years has really developed a robust internship program. So they not only have internship positions for middle school and high school students, but also for college students in the area. And adult coalition members work alongside those interns to gather and share data in different ways and to implement community activities. The interns have not only helped gather and share and make meaning out of data, but they also help conduct policy reviews, whether that's school or county policies. They've been engaged in advocacy work. They host community events, and then also they've conducted some like short mini QR code surveys during lunch at schools to get kind of the pulse of their peers. And so when we knew that the 2022 MSS data was coming out, I anticipated stepping in and helping them put together a data party plan, and their Winona State University intern stepped up and said, I got this. And I said, you go, you got this. And so I jumped on a call with them a couple of times, but that intern just did a fabulous job of putting together a data party toolkit. And so if you attend the 2023 Minnesota Program Sharing Conference, they'll be doing a session on that toolkit. So next slide. So there's kind of a taste of what the cover of the toolkit looks like. But the toolkit is kind of it's a guidance document for coalition members, community members, volunteers who want to throw a data party. There's elements in it for scaling up and scaling down, depending on how much time you have. Do you only have 20 minutes versus a full hour? And there's kind of a data party packet and tips for doing a party with young people versus doing a party with adults, but I think that they could all apply. And some of the elements are setting the stage for the party, playing some fun music. There's kind of a sampling of songs to consider as you're doing warm-ups and introductions. There's a warm-up bingo game, and people who win the bingo can win coalition swag as prizes. They have an activity where participants are given a data hat and they interact with other participants and have a data point in their hat. And so it's kind of like a true false quiz. They put together these really cool data placemats that have local statistics on them. They came up with a stand-up, sit-down activity where you use the number of young people standing up to show percentages. So 10 students are given a number from 1 to 10. And so if you're sharing a local statistic, you can ask students with numbers 5 through 10 to stand up and show what 50% would look like. So it's kind of a nice visual. Another thing that they did is create data scratch-offs. So had little cards with local data points on them and give people a penny or a sharp object to scratch off and see what the 2022 finding is for a particular measure. And then also at the end of the data party, kind of discussion about what people learned, that portion of making meaning out of the data, and of course, some treats. And they did get a chance to pilot it before today's session. And what was really cool is they piloted it with a math class, which I thought was really awesome because, you know, what better young people to get feedback from for a data gig than math students. And they had some really great feedback. They were very engaged, and they said, because it was a smaller class, the stand-up, sit-down activity didn't feel like quite the right fit. So they suggested finding activities to put in the toolkit for different sizes of parties. And they said by far of the party elements, their favorites were the bingo and scratch offs. So if you decide to try this at home, those were kind of the party favorites. So next slide. So now we're moving over to Becker County, and a big shout out to Karen Pfeiffer. She is a consultant who started the firm creating community consulting. She was formerly with Essentia, and she's done a ton of amazing work in greater Minnesota as well as North Dakota using this process called results-based accountability. So this is kind of approach number 3 of the 4 we're featuring. And it's a process for making data-driven decisions that's really focused on solutions. And so you gather community members together, young people, older people, to review local data and determine what the priorities are going to be. A few minutes ago, Jackie was talking about one of those projective factor trend charts that was showing a downward trend, and talked about how that's really an opportunity to change that trend. And that's exactly what you do using this RBA approach. Is in this group setting, you graph out those priority indicators, whether it's youth reporting depression or youth not feeling that adults in the community care about them. And then you forecast where that trend is going to go if the community does nothing, if you take no steps to improve that measure, business as usual, which way are you going to see that trend go? And then how can we turn that trend around? So part of that is identifying what the root causes are. Why are youth reporting higher rates of depression? Why are they not feeling that adults in the community care about them? What's kind of that story behind the numbers? And then it's a planning process. So who are the community partners that we can engage to turn the curve and make that change happen? And then just doing some brainstorming and really, again, bringing it back to those youth adult partnerships, listening and recognizing that everyone has something to contribute, and that the young people in the room are community leaders who have great ideas to contribute, and then putting together ultimately an action plan. So next slide. So they were doing results-based accountability throughout Becker County, and in really looking at their Minnesota student survey data, identified that Frazee, a community within the county, had especially high rates of youth mental health concerns, and especially low rates of young people feeling that adults in the community care about them. So the young people of Frazee went through their own results-based accountability process. And one thing that was really cool that they had the opportunity to do is that they were given a map of the community, and they were asked to draw on that map what a more welcoming and resilient community would look like. What did they want their community to look like? What do they want to see? And what would drive that success? And they drew many things. There were things like art materials and sculptures and murals in the community, and some of that has happened. But one of the big and cool and exciting things that they really wanted is to have a community center. And so Karen and her team did a lot of research to figure out what can make a community center for youth sustainable and vibrant. And ultimately, they created Cornerstone. One thing that's really cool, similar to Carleton County's Youth Advisory Board, is that the Cornerstone's advisory board has a number of young people at the table making those decisions. One of the elements that they have in Cornerstone is a bistro, because young people in those maps and in the RBA process said that there's only one cafe in town and it closes at 3 p.m. So there's nowhere to go for food. And also they really wanted a maker space where they could make art, they could make mugs and t-shirts and all of the things. And so Cornerstone also has a maker space, and that allows young people to make things and then sell those products in the bistro. And so both the bistro and the shop, driven by products from the makerspace, generate revenue that can be used to sustain the center. But then also there's just a hangout space for young people to go to after school, where there's couches, there's a kitchen with snacks, there's games. And so the hope is that ultimately in 2025, when they take a look at their Minnesota student survey data, they're going to see that young people in Frazee are really feeling like adults in the community care about them. Back over to you, Jackie.
All right. So I'll be doing the last case study that we have about a data summit. So I was working with a colleague of mine on some data with the Minnesota Student Survey, and she was asked to bring some down for the data summit that was going to be held in Faribault in Rice County. And I thought, oh, that'll be kind of interesting because that's my hometown. And as a queer person growing up in a small town, I didn't spend a lot of time after I graduated. I moved out the day after I graduated because it felt a little bit stifling there for me. So I thought it would be really interesting to go back and see what they're doing in Faribault. So the data summit began with Northfield, and then it grew to include Ford school districts. It was Northfield, Faribault, Waterville, Elysian, Morristown, which they call WEM, and then the Tri-City United. So they've had 4 summits so far. They started in 2019. Of course, then we had the pandemic, and so then they weren't able to meet again for another couple of years. They had one last winter, and then they had another one this spring, which is the one that I was able to attend. So the students last fall chose to focus on mental health indicators. Unfortunately, for the data summit last fall, the MSS data were not released yet, so they weren't able to use those. But then they were able to look at them this spring in May when I went. So I went down there with a colleague of mine, and I was watching the students look at what the data points were. And Janet Lewis-Muth is one of the people who was organizing this in Faribault, and she had asked for very specific data points. And I was looking at the kids, looking at them, and I kept thinking, we need to add more data. My colleague and I were talking about this. We need to show them what the associations are. And it turned out that we were not trusting the process, right? Because we were not doing the Socratic method. Instead of telling the students what the data meant and what the associations were, we should have been asking the students what the data meant, because who knows better what the data means than the people who are actually providing the data. And so this whole thing was a process also for me of learning to listen to the students and to hear how they interpreted the questions. So they're the ones who chose to concentrate on mental health indicators, and then they are the ones, with the help of the adults like Janet, who chose which factors they could affect, which things were actionable. So for example, students weren't probably able to come up with a lot of funding to have more counselors in the schools, but they brainstormed to see which things they could affect. So they decided to concentrate on student-teacher relationships, which is another reason that we relied so heavily on data concerning this topic in the previous part of the presentation. So they had the students look at the data and what do the data say? What do you think it means? When the question asks, do you have a good relationship with the teacher? What does that mean? How does a teacher demonstrate care for a student? What does it mean when you can talk to a teacher? How do you know that that teacher is open to talking? And then also, which I thought was incredibly insightful for these young people. They talked about what responsibility they had also to maintain these relationships with adults in their schools. I was really surprised at how mature these students were. So they divided up into groups for their districts, and they came up with practical plans to strengthen the relationships. And the group that I eavesdropped on, they came up with a whole plan of how to have one teacher who would be a student's homeroom teacher the whole time they're in high school. So every day, every year that student is in high school, they have a relationship with a teacher that they see every day. And there were other things that they added to the students added to the plan. Number one, this teacher had to, in the beginning, not be a teacher that was responsible for one of their classes. So the relationship could build as a mentorship instead of being based on getting good grades for a class, right? Which I thought was an amazing insight for these young people to have. And then also to have different activities in homeroom, such as like a Wellness Wednesday, where the students work on mental health issues and that sort of thing, so that they feel like they're in a context where they're supported, and they're supported by the same adult all the way through their journey through school. And then I think what was also incredibly important part of this process that the adults obviously arranged for the students is to have the principals come in, sit down in a chair and be surrounded by the students, and then have the plan explained to them, and then have a dialogue with the principal about how to put this plan into action. I was so impressed with the young people who did this. I was really impressed with the adults like Janet Lewis-Muth, who facilitated this discussion. And I was really also impressed with the principals that came in and listened to what the students had to say. So I think, again, we all kind of need to be reminded to listen. I mean, as an undergrad, I was talking about medical ethics, and it was about listening to the people who were involved, especially in things like Tuskegee, et cetera. When I was a grad student, I did research on local people who were affected by environmental conservation programs. So again, it wasn't just about the data, it was listening to the people. And so even now, even though we have all of this data from students, it's important to hear their voices and hear how they interpret the data and how they feel about it. So, and I just wanted to say this whole process kind of had a bonus because we were talking about how to affect students feeling more positively about the future, how to have them feel more in control of their lives and have meaningful relationships with adults. And programs like these will affect all of those different indicators that make up the developmental assets, groups of positive attributes. So Melissa and I think we're hoping that people would be able to share any case studies that they might have that they want to talk about. I know we didn't send anything out ahead of time, so people might not be prepared to talk about this, but if anybody has anything to share, we would, I think, all love to hear it.
Can we ask questions?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. And hearing your the 4 case studies, which I've written down because I intend to find out the relationship these case studies had to our employment and training programs in those particular 4 counties. You mentioned something about the future. Did these young people, what did they talk about the future in terms of, let's say, jobs, in terms of adult life, in terms of relationships, in terms of where they want to live? Did they even talk about that? And in terms of how mental health would affect their decisions?
Yeah, I just kind of entered this in the chat, but from my familiarity with the communities that I shared, I'm not in those communities. I don't know about conversations they've had about the impact of their current mental health may have on their future lives. But in terms of, the Cornerstone Youth Advisory Board and the summer credit recovery courses and the internship in Winona, all of those are really working with young people to help them elevate their voice and feel empowered, providing some entrepreneurial skills, I think, especially with the makerspace, learning job skills like advocacy, going before a county board or a school board and sharing suggestions. So they're all future-oriented skills, but I am not aware of any conversations where youth were engaging with Minnesota Student Survey data and talking about future employment where they see themselves living.
Yeah, I think that question might also be better answered by a lot of the people in the audience, because I think people in the audience are more likely to have been working with youth. Unfortunately, most of my work is dealing with data, and it's just me and my 2 little dogs in my office. So I don't actually get a lot of input from children besides what, I have as the numbers on my screens.
Those dogs perhaps could provide a great deal of input. So don't discount a canine insight into the data.
Usually more treats. That's their insight.
But like Jackie said, we would love to hear if anyone has used any of these approaches to engage with young people in making meaning out of data, or a different approach that we didn't cover. Or did you hear something you want to try?
Can I talk? I don't have a great case study. This is Kenny from Families and Communities Thrive Together. I have a friend right now who's got a son going to school in Sweden, and we've heard about Finland before, where like the couple of years or whatever. Well, he's got, granted, this is grade school and growing up, but a team of 3 teachers that are it's the same team for 3 solid years. And so like, see how much more opportunity to make a connection, which I think is so great. And the Faribault, I heart Faribault, I used to have I had a business down there for a couple of years, and like, just like, there's such more need there than anywhere I've ever seen. And so I really appreciate that. The math scientist in me needs to share, like, I appreciate Lowell asking about the questions earlier, because number one, I kind of would love to see the actual questions shared with the results so that we can really see and analyze what we're looking at. And so, and a note too, that when we alter the questions, it could jeopardize the actual relation to like the previous year's results. And so no, we can look at that and see like, or the trends are getting better, or what we're doing is getting better. Oh, well, no, maybe it's not. Maybe we just are comparing different questions and different scores. So we can't, I really want to call it an ACEs score. And like, if the ACEs study, like if that team of people overall tweak a question here and there, it's still going to be different than like leaving out a question and like missing the neglect. Neglect is a huge thing. So I was surprised to see like, wow, 50-some% have 0. That's a great number. How is that possible? Oh, because we left something out. That's the science needs to like compare the same things. So thank you.
I see Melissa's about to say something, but I just wanted to make one quick thing, is that the original ACEs study was done with adults. So it was adults looking back on their historical experiences. It wasn't done with youth. And so you can ask different questions of adults than you can ask of youth who are in the middle of it, who might not understand certain types of things. And also they were volunteering as adults who were able to give consent to answer these questions, probably could answer more difficult questions than we can just ask of the average student in Minnesota. So that is going to make the questions be different. But I will say that although the question about household mental health was added in 2019, the questions have otherwise remained relatively stable over time. When I had that graph up there before, those questions were the same questions over time. So there is very good comparability, at least if you're looking at the ACEs score from the Minnesota Student Survey.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. And thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, and I would say too, always, if you're looking at a report or listening to a presentation, find out how many ACE items are included and what they are. It is going to vary. They're not all the same. And I would make an argument that that's kind of a good thing. Jackie and I and others in Minnesota too have also looked at kind of more of an expanded ACE score. So there are items on the Minnesota Student Survey that ask about dating violence, about trafficking, about experience in the foster care, being harassed. Those are all potentially traumatic experiences for young people. So some people have created a more expanded ACE score, and then you're going to see the number of ACEs people experience going up. So my personal opinion is that there's not a right and a wrong way to assess it. It's just knowing what you're looking at.
Okay, again, thank you.
Is there any follow-up on the individuals who take the survey? With the individuals, the high school juniors and seniors, actually it's 11th grade, so it's juniors, high school juniors in 2016, in terms of their ultimate, hopefully it's not their ultimate, their life paths upon graduation from high school, with the responses they gave in 2016, and analyzing those responses and then seeing what happened in 2022 or whatever year you want to choose, and some sort of validation of these 2016 results with real life experiences that these individuals responded to.
Potentially there's someone at the University of Minnesota who's done something like that. The Minnesota Student Survey is put on by the Minnesota Student Survey Interagency Team, which is made up of a couple of representatives from each of the state agencies. And they have a very finite budget that just covers doing the survey every 3 years. There just aren't the resources for trying to track down former Minnesota students and doing a longitudinal study. But if I ever see that grant out there, I will write the proposal and try and get the funds to do it.
It's also, again, it's anonymous. So it'd be really hard to find those students. They're probably off in college in other states, or who knows. It would be really hard to find them. We do have some data from young adults in Minnesota. So we have the BRFIS, we have the NSDA, and we have some surveys at the college levels. So it's possible to look at that. But yeah, it would be nice to have a longitudinal study. Again, nowhere near the budget for that. We barely have the budget for the MSS.
Yes, I do know the U of M is now doing a job study of youth that we're involved, that Deed is involved with, and so yeah, okay. But there hasn't been a follow-up with this specific survey. It would be just interesting to note we responded to this way as a junior, and this is the way it's turned out subsequent to our high school graduation.
What the Minnesota Student Survey does allow us to do is kind of take a look at a cohort. So students who take the survey as 5th graders take it again 3 years later as 8th graders, and again 3 years later as 11th graders. But going back to Jackie's point about it being anonymous, it could be that that young person lived in Carlton County when they were a 5th grader and then moved to Winona County as an 8th grader. So each iteration of the survey, it's not totally apples to apples.
Thank you. So many great questions today. So I did want to wrap us up because I see that we're just about at 2:30. And so if people have other questions and they want to kind of hang on for a couple minutes, would that be okay, Jackie and Melissa?
Yeah.
Okay. So feel free, but I just wanted to make a quick note if anyone needs to take a break before the final closing session. We really encourage you to join the closing session. Cassandra will be putting in the links to that final session and where you can find that in just a moment. And just wanted to thank you all for your engaging questions. Really has kind of helped keep this topic really interesting and engaging today. And a huge thank you to Jackie and Melissa for joining and sharing their wisdom. So please kind of join me in thanking them as well, whether you do it non-verbally or verbally. Just really appreciate your time today. So thank you. Thanks for being here, everyone. And we hope to see you in the closing session, and we'll just stick around for a couple minutes if anyone wants to kind of hang on for a few moments. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next session in about 15 minutes.
And I just want to reiterate that it is my job to do technical assistance. So if people have questions about mental health and substance use concerns, or about adverse childhood experiences, or anything about the Minnesota Student Survey, what kind of questions are on there or whatever, please email me and ask. I would love to answer your questions.
Thank you both very much. It's kind of lent some light to the student survey that originally was something very, very dark and complicated, but thank you.
Thank you.